The creation of the Lunacy Act of 1541 is the most brutal proof of King Henry VIII's tyranny. This cold-blooded law was enacted for a single purpose: to legalize the beheading of Jane Rochford, a noblewoman terrified into absolute madness. This death sentence was the ultimate revenge of a cuckolded king against the procurer who turned the royal bedchamber into a den of illicit affairs. For centuries, this massive scandal allowed the world to condemn her as the court's most notorious betrayer, a woman who selfishly trampled on the lives of her own husband, George, and Queen Anne Boleyn to survive. But was she truly a monster, or just a desperate player in a rigged game? Grim reality proved that when you dare to play with Tudor power, death is sometimes not the worst fate. She was born Jane Parker. While exact parish birth records from this era are often lost to time, surviving documents suggest she was born around the year 1505. She was born right into the absolute upper echelons of the English aristocracy. Her father was Henry Parker, the 10th Baron Morley. To understand Jane's mind, you must understand her father. Lord Morley was not just a wealthy absentee landowner managing rural country estates. He was a highly respected scholar. He was an intellectual. He was a prominent translator of Italian Renaissance literature, particularly known for translating the complex works of Petrarch into English. He was a man of deep humanist intellect. Crucially, he had cultivated close personal friendships with the highest tier of Tudor royalty. Lord Morley had a strong, enduring bond with Margaret Beaufort. She was the formidable, highly intelligent grandmother of King Henry VIII. She was the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. This connection placed the Parker family firmly within the king's inner circle. Jane's mother, Alice St. John, possessed an even greater political asset. She carried distant but undeniable blood ties to the king himself. The St. John family tree intertwined with the royal lineage, granting the Parkers a status that could not be bought with mere wealth. Because of this deeply privileged intellectual background, Jane received an elite education. This is a crucial detail. This was a time when the humanist movement, championed by scholars like Thomas More and Erasmus, was just beginning to change how noble families viewed their daughters. While many aristocratic women of the era were taught little more than basic needlework, estate management, and religious piety, surviving records suggest Jane was educated to a much higher, more rigorous standard. She was taught to read and write fluently. She learned Latin and French. French in particular was the absolute vital language of European diplomacy and courtly romance. She was also rigorously trained in the highly structured, delicate arts of the Tudor court. She learned complex, courtly dances. She learned to play musical instruments. She learned the art of polite, layered conversation. From childhood, Jane was deliberately bred to navigate the treacherous, glittering halls of royal power. She was taught early on that a noblewoman's true influence was not wielded on a battlefield. It was wielded in the quiet, sophisticated conversations held behind closed doors. By the year 1522, when she was roughly 16 or 17 years old, that meticulous training paid off. Jane was sent from her family's country estate to the royal court in London. She was appointed to serve as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, King Henry VIII's first wife. In the Tudor era, being a maid of honor was not a menial domestic job. You did not scrub floors. It was a highly coveted political placement. It put a young woman in the exact same room as the king, the queen, the king's chief ministers, and the most powerful foreign ambassadors in the world. It was a place to see and be seen. It was the premier marriage market in the kingdom. We get our first vivid, undeniable glimpse of Jane on the historical stage in early March of 1522. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's immensely powerful chief minister, hosted a spectacular diplomatic event. It took place at York Place, his massive London residence. The evening's entertainment was an elaborate indoor pageant. It was called the Chateau Vert, or the Green Castle. To understand the Tudor court, one must understand these pageants. They were not mere parties. They were highly choreographed, massively expensive displays of national wealth, political hierarchy, and royal favor. A massive wooden castle covered entirely in shimmering green tin foil was wheeled into the center of the banqueting hall. Jane Parker was specifically chosen to participate. She was selected as one of only 7 elite young women to perform the main dance in front of the king and the assembled diplomats. In these symbolic, allegorical pageants, every dancer was dressed in blindingly expensive silks. Furthermore, each woman was assigned to represent a specific noble virtue. The role Jane was given to play that night was constancy. It is a bitterly ironic title. It stands in stark contrast to how the official historical record would later attempt to define her life as one of malicious betrayal. But what makes this specific night truly remarkable is the company she kept. Dancing right beside her in that glittering candlelit hall were 2 ambitious sisters. They were playing the roles of beauty and perseverance. They had recently arrived at the English court, returning from their sophisticated education in France. Their names were Mary and Anne Boleyn. Jane fit perfectly into this glamorous, high-stakes world. She belonged there. Surviving expense records from the royal wardrobe, alongside her own financial accounts, show us that she was a major trendsetter. She was a woman who clearly understood the Tudor maxim that appearance was raw power. She frequently ordered incredibly expensive custom-tailored gowns. Many records detail dresses made of rich green velvet, woven intricately with gold and silver thread. These fabrics were heavily restricted by sumptuary laws. Wearing them was a public declaration of immense wealth and high favor. She was sharp. She was fashionable. She was confident. She was deeply embedded in the social fabric of the palace. She had successfully arrived at the absolute center of the English universe. She was rubbing shoulders with future queens. But a maid of honor was only a temporary position. To secure permanent power, lasting wealth, and physical security, she needed a political alliance. She needed a husband. But glittering pageants and expensive velvet were only the surface of Tudor power. Beneath the music and the dancing, the royal court was a ruthless, calculating marriage market. A maid of honor like Jane Parker could not remain a mere servant forever. To secure her family's legacy and her own physical safety, she needed an ironclad alliance. And in the shifting political sands of the 1520s, one specific family was rising faster than any other. Jane was about to bind her fate to a dynasty that would permanently alter the course of English history. Sometime around late 1524 or early 1525, a profound political merger took place within the glittering halls of the Tudor court. Jane Parker was married to George Boleyn. He was the charismatic, highly intelligent, and deeply ambitious brother of Mary and Anne Boleyn. This union must not be viewed as a minor background event in the English social calendar. It was a major, highly calculated consolidation of dynastic power. To understand their relationship, we must discard modern romantic sensibilities. In the 16th century, elite aristocratic marriages were rarely built on the concepts of romantic love. They were almost never about strict sexual fidelity. They were business transactions. They were designed to build political empires, merge vast agricultural estates, and secure direct physical access to the king. In this specific pragmatic regard, the marriage between Jane and George was initially a massive success. Jane brought with her an immense dowry of 2,000 marks. This was a sum of money so staggering that King Henry VIII actually stepped in to contribute a significant portion of it directly out of his own royal coffers. This financial contribution was not a casual gift. It was a clear, undeniable sign of supreme royal favor for the rising Boleyn family. The young couple was richly rewarded for their loyalty to the crown. They were gifted the lucrative manor of Grimston. Later, the king granted them the exclusive use of the magnificent palace of Beaulieu in Essex. By 1529, as the Boleyn family's political star reached its absolute zenith alongside Anne's rise to power, George and Jane were officially elevated in the English peerage. They became the Viscount and Viscountess Rochford. However, for hundreds of years, historians have confidently told audiences a very different, highly sensationalized story about this marriage. If you read classic Victorian histories or watch many modern historical dramas, they present a miserable, deeply toxic household. They tell us that Jane bitterly hated George. They claim George openly despised Jane. There is a persistent popular modern myth that George Boleyn was secretly homosexual, and that this hidden orientation caused a deep, hateful rift between him and a jealous conservative wife. This specific theory is based almost entirely on a single, highly ambiguous piece of evidence. It relies on a satirical, cynical poem about the burdens of marriage found in a book that George once owned. Beneath the poem is a faint signature that reads Mark S. For decades, writers speculated that this was Mark Smeaton. He was the court musician who would later be executed alongside George. Many use this to imply a secret romantic relationship between the two men. However, modern historical researchers must rely on harder evidence. Contemporary historians, most notably Julia Fox, have rigorously investigated and largely dismantled this narrative. The reality of the Tudor court was much more pragmatic. It was also much more brutal. George Boleyn was actually notorious among the European ambassadors for his relentless womanizing. He was described in contemporary diplomatic dispatches as a man who would fiercely pursue women at court. He was a charming, highly educated, but undeniably arrogant predator. He was not a man harboring a secret that alienated his wife. He was simply a typical Tudor nobleman exercising his extreme privilege. Furthermore, Jane was not a marginalized, bitter wife, sitting quietly in a country house, seething with resentment. She was a fiercely loyal, highly active member of the Boleyn political faction. Surviving records from the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, provide a fascinating glimpse into her true role. They indicate that in 1534, Jane actively conspired directly with Queen Anne Boleyn. It was a highly dangerous secret plot. The king had taken a new, unnamed mistress. Anne Boleyn, now feeling incredibly insecure as she struggled to produce a male heir, desperately wanted this rival gone. Jane used her influence to help orchestrate a plan to banish this young woman from the royal court. When King Henry found out about their meddling, his reaction was explosive. He did not punish Anne directly, as she was the anointed queen, but he severely punished Jane. The king exiled Lady Rochford from the royal palace for several months. In the terrifying environment of the Tudor court, You do not risk the violent, unpredictable wrath of King Henry VIII to help a sister-in-law and a husband that you secretly hate. You do not risk your own wealth and your hard-won position at court out of pure spite. Jane was a Boleyn loyalist. She operated as a core, trusted member of their political machine. But that glittering Boleyn empire completely collapsed in the blood-soaked spring of 1536. Queen Anne Boleyn had tragically failed to provide the king with a living, healthy male heir. She had suffered a devastating miscarriage in January of that year. Many historians note that the fetus appeared to be male. Henry's eyes had already wandered to a quiet, submissive woman named Jane Seymour. The king decided he needed a permanent way out of his marriage. Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless and brilliant chief minister, was tasked with the unthinkable. He had to annihilate the Boleyn faction entirely. He had to manufacture a legal justification to execute a queen. In May of 1536, George and Anne Boleyn were suddenly arrested. They were thrown into the Tower of London. They were charged with the shocking, unspeakable crimes of high treason, adultery, and incest. This is the exact defining moment where the myth of the wicked wife was permanently cemented into history. Later chroniclers quickly branded Jane as a jealous, spiteful woman. The official, heavily sanitized narrative claimed that she fabricated the incest charges out of thin air. It was said she maliciously whispered lies to Cromwell, simply to rid herself of a husband she despised. The historical reality of May 1536 is a story of extreme psychological coercion and state terror. Thomas Cromwell needed airtight, unassailable evidence. He cast a massive, terrifying dragnet. He brought in anyone remotely close to Anne's inner circle. Jane was hauled into an interrogation room. She was subjected to brutal, unrelenting psychological pressure by the most terrifying politician in England. Cromwell squeezed her for every piece of court gossip. He demanded every whispered secret and every private conversation she possessed. He threatened her with the same fate as her husband if she withheld information. Many modern historians heavily argue that Jane did not invent the story of incest. What she actually confessed under this immense pressure was a secret that was arguably much more dangerous to the king's fragile ego. She reportedly admitted to the interrogators that Queen Anne had confided in her a deeply personal, highly humiliating secret. King Henry VIII was impotent. He was increasingly unable to perform in the royal bed. Jane admitted that after Anne told her this, she had gone home and passed this explosive information to her husband George. In Tudor England, discussing the king's sexual incapacity was not just idle, embarrassing gossip. It was a direct act of high treason. It legally threatened the entire line of succession. It implied that if Anne did conceive a child, it might not actually belong to the king. Under the Treason Act, to merely imagine or discuss the death or physical failure of the king was a capital offense. Jane was backed into a legal corner. If she lied to Cromwell, or if she attempted to hide what she knew, she would be dragged to the executioner's block herself for misprision of treason, the crime of concealing treasonous knowledge. Yet even in the middle of this waking nightmare, there is compelling documentary proof that Jane did not cold-heartedly abandon her husband to his fate. Contrary to the enduring myth of the vindictive wife, the official records of Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower of London, show a very different story. Kingston carefully reported to Cromwell that Jane secretly managed to send a message deep into the dungeon to George. In that desperate message, she promised her husband that she would personally humble herself. She promised to petition the king directly for his pardon. She tried to use whatever remaining influence she had to save his life. This is not the action of a woman who just intentionally framed her husband for incest. But her desperate efforts were entirely useless. The machine had already decided their fate. When the executioner's axe fell on George Boleyn's neck on May 17, 1536, Jane's entire world evaporated in an instant. The Tudor state retaliated against the convicted traitor's family with absolute devastating force. As the heavy iron gates of the Tower of London finally closed, the Boleyn faction was completely annihilated. Because strict 16th century laws of coverture heavily favored male heirs, the crown's reach was total. The state immediately confiscated everything. Jane was officially stripped of her prestigious title and denied her right to a traditional widow's jointure. She lost her grand manors, her magnificent jewels, her luxurious clothing, and her high social status. In a single blood-soaked afternoon, the glittering world she had meticulously built was washed away. She went from being a core member of England's most powerful political family to a social pariah, cast out into sudden, terrifying financial ruin. Former allies turned their backs. The Boleyn name was now a lethal liability. To survive this absolute catastrophe, the proud, highly educated aristocratic woman had to navigate the ashes of her life alone. She was forced to swallow her dignity and make a drastic, deeply humiliating choice. Most noble women in her devastating position would have immediately retreated to a quiet, distant country house. They would have relied heavily on the charity of distant relatives. They would have hidden in rural obscurity for the rest of their lives, terrified of ever drawing the volatile, dangerous attention of King Henry VIII again. But Jane Parker was fundamentally a creature of the royal court. The palaces of London were the only ecosystem she truly understood. More importantly, they were the only places where true power, influence, and physical security could be leveraged. Instead of hiding in the shadows, Jane executed a master class in political survival. She reached out to the most dangerous man in the kingdom. She wrote a desperate, deeply calculated letter to Thomas Cromwell. This was the very man who had just orchestrated the brutal deaths of her husband and her sister-in-law. Reaching out to him required immense, almost unimaginable psychological discipline. In this surviving letter, she completely strips away her former aristocratic pride. She does not demand her rights. She does not defend her late husband. She refers to herself submissively as a poor, desolate widow. She begged the king's ruthless chief minister to personally intervene on her behalf. Her request was highly pragmatic. She asked for a modest annual pension of £100. In the context of the Tudor elite, this was a massive, humiliating downgrade from her previous immense wealth. But it was a calculated number. It was just enough money to afford to feed herself. It allowed her to maintain a basic, respectable household. It allowed her to keep a vital physical foothold in London. Through sheer political maneuvering, relentless networking, and relying heavily on Cromwell's fragile, dangerous patronage, Jane slowly clawed her way back from the ashes. Cromwell, for his part, recognized her utility. He knew she was a highly intelligent, deeply connected woman who was now entirely dependent on him. She owed him her survival. By 1537, she achieved the seemingly impossible. She managed to secure a coveted position as a lady-in-waiting to King Henry's third wife, Queen Jane Seymour. Imagine the immense psychological toll this daily reality required. Jane Rochford had to stand quietly in the background. She had to hold the train and serve the daily, intimate needs of the exact woman who had replaced her executed sister-in-law. She had to smile and bow to the king who had signed her husband's death warrant. She had to share rooms with women who had actively helped tear the Boleyns down. But Jane understood the new brutal rules of the game perfectly. She kept her head down. She remained entirely unobtrusive. She did her job flawlessly. She proved to the king and his ministers that she was not a bitter, vengeful threat. She proved she was a useful, obedient servant. When Queen Jane Seymour tragically died, giving birth to the king's only legitimate son, Prince Edward, in October 1537, the court was plunged into deep mourning. The king withdrew into his grief. Yet Jane Rochford's survival skills were tested and proven once again. When King Henry eventually decided to marry his fourth wife, the German Protestant Princess Anne of Cleves, in early 1540, Jane seamlessly transitioned into the new queen's household. She was now a seasoned veteran of the royal bedchamber. It was during this brief, politically disastrous royal marriage that Jane Rochford firmly proved her absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the crown. King Henry VIII almost immediately decided he found his new foreign bride physically repulsive. The vital diplomatic alliance with the German princes was crumbling. Henry desperately wanted a legal annulment to end the marriage. However, international diplomacy prevented him from simply executing her or casting her aside without cause. The eyes of Europe were watching. The king needed concrete, unassailable legal evidence. Under canon law, he needed to prove that the royal marriage had never been physically consummated. He needed an insider. He needed someone with intimate, unquestioned access to the queen's private bedchamber. He needed someone who could report on the queen's most private conversations. It was Jane Rochford who stepped forward out of the shadows. As a senior, highly experienced lady-in-waiting, Jane was privy to the most sensitive private conversations among the women of the court. Anne of Cleves was a foreigner. She spoke very little English upon her arrival. She was entirely naive to the lethal politics of the English court. She relied heavily on her ladies for guidance. Surviving state papers rigorously record Jane's highly specific testimony. Jane provided the king's investigators with crucial details regarding the naive conversations held in the queen's rooms. Many historians note that Jane testified about Anne of Cleves's profound, almost childlike innocence. Jane reported asking the queen if she was still a maid. She reported that Anne believed she was truly a wife simply because the king came into her bed, kissed her, and said, "Good night, sweetheart," and kissed her again in the morning. Jane officially confirmed on the legal record that the king had never touched his new bride in a marital sense. This was not an act of petty, malicious gossip. It was not personal malice against Anne of Cleves. It was a cold, highly calculated move of political survival. Jane Rochford handed King Henry VIII the exact legal ammunition he needed to peacefully and quickly dissolve the union. By doing so, Jane had proven herself immensely useful to the sovereign. She demonstrated that she was a highly capable, discreet operator. She proved she prioritized the king's desires over all other loyalties. By the summer of 1540, Jane had successfully navigated the treacherous reigns of 4 entirely different queens. Through a highly calculated mix of submission and strategic utility, she had clawed her way back to the very center of the Tudor universe, evolving from a disgraced widow into the ultimate royal fixer. She had secured her permanent position and her pension, yet this hard-won security was about to face its greatest and undeniably fatal test. Following the swift, humiliating annulment of his fourth marriage, King Henry VIII married almost immediately. Jane was instantly appointed as the principal lady-in-waiting to his fifth wife. This new queen was not a seasoned European politician. She was not a foreign princess backed by a powerful standing army. She was a vibrant, reckless, and highly inexperienced teenager named Catherine Howard. The marriage between the king and Catherine Howard was a grotesque, deeply unsettling mismatch. It was a union built entirely on delusion and the immense political ambition of the conservative Howard faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk. They ruthlessly used the beautiful teenager as a political pawn to gain physical proximity to the crown. Her youth and sheer political naivety would soon drag Jane into the most lethal conspiracy of her entire life. Historical records regarding Catherine's exact birth year are incomplete. However, most modern historians agree she was a teenager. She was likely around 18 or 19 years old when she was suddenly thrust onto the throne. She was entirely unequipped for the lethal, calculating politics of the royal court. King Henry VIII, on the other hand, was now approaching 50 years old. The golden, athletic Renaissance prince of his youth was entirely gone. Surviving medical accounts, armor measurements, and diplomatic dispatches paint a grim, undeniable picture of the monarch. He was morbidly obese. His waist size had expanded to an estimated 52 inches. He was deeply paranoid. He suffered from foul-smelling, ulcerated wounds on his legs. Many modern medical historians strongly suspect this was severe osteomyelitis or untreated leg ulcers exacerbated by diabetes. These wounds stubbornly refused to heal. They caused him immense chronic agony. He frequently required a mechanical wooden contraption just to be hoisted onto his horse. His physical decay was a stark reality that the entire court was forced to ignore under the threat of treason. Yet the king was entirely blinded by his own fading ego. He famously viewed the teenage Catherine as his rose without a thorn. She was a living, breathing delusion. She allowed the aging, ailing tyrant to pretend he was still young, virile, and universally desired by beautiful women. Catherine, however, was legally trapped. She was bound to a decaying, volatile man who terrified the entire nation. It is perhaps historically unsurprising that the young queen made a fatal error. She looked for romance and physical affection elsewhere within the suffocating walls of the palace. The man who caught her attention was Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was not a marginalized outsider. He was not a lowly castle guard. He was a handsome, highly ambitious, aristocratic courtier. He worked as a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. This was an incredibly powerful position. It meant he had direct, intimate access to the king himself. He dressed the king. He slept in the king's private rooms. He had the king's absolute trust. He was also a man with a notoriously violent past. Historical court records from 1539 indicate he was accused of a brutal crime. He was charged with the rape of a park keeper's wife and the murder of a villager who tried to intervene. Yet King Henry personally pardoned him. He was a dangerous, volatile, and highly protected choice for a royal romance. But instead of protecting the young, foolish queen, Jane Rochford made a choice that still baffles scholars today. Instead of using her decades of survival experience to quietly shut the romance down, Jane stepped completely over the line. She transitioned from a dutiful lady-in-waiting to an active, facilitating royal madam. Jane actively brokered this highly dangerous, overtly treasonous affair. The sheer logistics of what Jane Rochford pulled off over the next year are breathtaking. They reveal a woman with nerves of absolute steel. She operated flawlessly under the most extreme pressure imaginable. In the late summer of 1541, King Henry took his new queen and the entire royal court on a massive logistical undertaking. This was known as the Northern Progress. It was a massive caravan of over 5,000 horses. They traveled deep into the north of England. The king aimed to display his royal authority in regions that had recently rebelled against the crown during the Pilgrimage of Grace. The progress was chaotic. The court moved constantly. While they were staying at heavy, intimidating stone fortresses like Lincoln and Pontefract castles, Jane Rochford went to work. Surviving testimonies from the subsequent investigations detail her exact methodical actions. She used her senior position within the Queen's household to completely clear the board. She pulled rank over the younger women. She explicitly ordered the other maids of honor, women like Catherine Tilney and Margaret Morton, out of the Queen's bedchamber at night. She secured the physical iron keys to the back stairs. She controlled the hidden service doors of the royal apartments. Jane personally stood guard in the freezing, drafty stone corridors. In the dead of night, long after the rest of the massive castle had gone to sleep, she would quietly unlock the doors. She would smuggle Thomas Culpeper up the dark, winding stairs. She would usher him into the Queen's private bedroom. These secret meetings usually occurred around 11 o'clock at night. Then, Jane would stand watch outside the heavy wooden door. She paced the corridor in the dark. She kept an ear out for any approaching royal guards. She often waited until 2 or 3 in the morning, and she did all of this while the volatile, highly dangerous King Henry VIII slept in the very next room. He was separated from his cheating wife only by a wooden partition or a heavy woven tapestry. The sheer audacity of the proximity is staggering. There is a surviving, desperate love letter that proves just how central Jane was to this entire operation. It is one of the most famous documents of the Tudor era. It was written by Catherine Howard to Thomas Culpeper. In her own handwriting, the young queen explicitly gives her lover a vital instruction. She wrote, "Come when my Lady Rochford is here." Jane was not a passive bystander. Some romanticized historical fiction suggests she was bullied or coerced into helping the queen. However, the primary sources strongly indicate otherwise. She was the indispensable, highly active architect of the affair. She controlled the schedule. She controlled the access. The historical question that remains heavily debated is simply, why? Why would a woman who had already survived the bloody execution of her husband risk her neck for a teenager's doomed romance? She knew exactly how ruthless King Henry could be. She had seen the executioner's sword firsthand. Many historians argue different psychological theories. Was Jane living vicariously through the young queen? Was she experiencing a romantic thrill she had never found in her own pragmatic political marriage to George Boleyn? Was she simply addicted to the pure adrenaline of secret power? Did she take a perverse joy in actively outsmarting the most terrifying king in Europe right under his own roof? Or did she coldly calculate a political strategy? Did she believe that by holding the queen's darkest, most dangerous secret, she would make herself entirely indispensable? Did she believe this ultimate leverage would secure her own position, her influence, and her wealth forever? Whatever her true inner motive was, her actions constituted an act of profound, staggering disrespect to the crown. In Tudor England, this was not just a simple matter of domestic infidelity. It was a direct, undeniable act of high treason. It directly threatened to introduce illegitimate blood into the royal line of succession. If Catherine Howard had fallen pregnant by Thomas Culpeper, A bastard child could have inherited the throne of England. It would have plunged the nation back into civil war. Furthermore, it deeply emasculated a monarch who was already intensely sensitive about his fading virility and his physical decline. Jane Rochford and Catherine Howard were turning the terrifying King Henry VIII into a cuckolded joke. They were mocking the supreme head of the English state. For months, the heavy wooden doors and the dark stone quarters of the northern fortresses kept the secret safe. Jane Rochford and Queen Catherine Howard were playing a deadly game of Russian roulette with the Tudor legal machine, successfully smuggling the king's favorite courtier into the royal bedchamber directly under the sovereign's nose. It was a high-wire political act of breathtaking audacity, but the Tudor court was an ecosystem built entirely on whispers, spies, and hidden agendas. A dark secret shared by 3 people in a royal household of hundreds is an incredibly fragile thing. As the massive caravan finally turned south, making its exhausting journey back to the magnificent Hampton Court Palace in the autumn of 1541, the chamber finally clicked. The fragile, treasonous bubble they had meticulously built was about to burst wide open, and the past was coming to collect its bloody toll. The precise timeline of the collapse is meticulously recorded in surviving Tudor state papers. It began on November 1st, 1541. It was All Saints' Day. King Henry VIII was attending solemn mass in the Chapel Royal. He was publicly giving thanks to God for his beautiful, seemingly pure young wife. He famously directed his bishop to lead the congregation in a prayer of gratitude for the good life he led and trusted to lead with Catherine. He called her his jewel of womanhood. During this deeply sacred religious service, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, approached the king. He did not speak. To speak such words aloud in the king's presence could be construed as treason. Instead, Cranmer quietly slipped a sealed document directly into the king's hand. The letter contained devastating explosive information. It detailed Catherine Howard's sexual indiscretions long before she ever wore the English crown. The information had been brought to Cranmer by a Protestant reformer named John Lascelles. Lascelles had a sister named Mary. Mary Lascelles had served in the same noble household as Catherine during their youth. They both lived under the careless, unsupervised roof of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk at Lambeth. Mary knew everything about the teenager's physical relationships. She detailed Catherine's encounters with a music teacher named Henry Mannix and a gentleman retainer named Francis Derham. King Henry's initial reaction was not an explosive, violent rage. It was profound, absolute denial. He flatly refused to believe the contents of the letter. He thought it was a malicious forgery. He believed his political enemies were trying to destroy his newfound domestic happiness. However, as a deeply paranoid monarch, he could not simply ignore a formal accusation against the Queen's purity. He ordered a strict, highly secretive investigation. He tasked Cranmer and his ruthless ministers to find the truth, fully expecting them to clear the Queen's name. That quiet investigation rapidly unraveled the entire fabric of the Queen's household. The king's investigators moved swiftly. They pulled forcefully at the loose threads of Catherine's past. They arrested Henry Mannix and Francis Derham. They brought them into the terrifying, torch-lit interrogation rooms of the Tudor state. Under harsh, relentless questioning, Derham fought desperately to save his own life. He admitted to a physical relationship with Catherine before she was queen, claiming they were essentially engaged. But to deflect the investigators' attention away from his past actions, he pointed them directly toward the present. Derham told the interrogators to stop looking at him. He told them to look at the Queen's current behavior. He specifically named Thomas Culpeper. The investigation immediately spilled over from a historical scandal into a present-day crisis. The hidden, treasonous affair, orchestrated during the Northern Progress, finally tumbled out into the open. The royal palace went into immediate, terrifying lockdown. The heavy oak doors of the Queen's apartments were guarded. The King's initial denial fractured into absolute devastating wrath. Under the direct threat of the rack and the executioner's block, both Queen Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper completely panicked. They were desperate, terrified individuals. They knew they had committed high treason. They knew there was no mercy to be found in King Henry VIII. They desperately needed a scapegoat to lessen their own guilt. They turned completely on Jane Rochford. They threw her directly to the wolves. According to surviving interrogation transcripts, both the Queen and her lover told the King's ministers that they were merely innocent, coerced victims. They laid the entire blame at the feet of Lady Rochford's malicious machinations. They officially claimed that Jane had aggressively instigated the romance. They testified that she had constantly provoked them. They swore that she had carried secret messages between them and practically forced them into each other's arms against their better judgment. They painted Jane as the venomous mastermind of the entire treasonous plot. Jane Rochford was immediately arrested. She was stripped of her elegant court gowns. She was violently removed from her comfortable warm rooms in the royal palaces. She was placed on a heavily guarded barge. She was transported down the freezing gray waters of the River Thames. She passed beneath the iron grate of Traitor's Gate. She was thrown directly into the damp, terrifying dungeons of the Tower of London. For Jane, this was the absolute catastrophic breaking point. The Tower of London was not just a royal prison for her, it was a tomb, being locked inside a freezing cell in the exact same grim fortress where her husband, George Boleyn, and her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn, had been slaughtered just 5 years earlier, was simply too much to bear. The thick stone walls closed in on her. The suffocating, unresolved trauma of 1536 rushed back with violent, inescapable force. She was back in the nightmare she had spent half a decade desperately trying to outrun. The damp, crushing isolation of the tower had finally broken the ultimate survivor. Jane Rochford, the brilliant political operator, was now entirely lost in a maze of her own shattered mind. This sudden descent into severe madness accidentally created a massive, unprecedented legal crisis that collided violently with centuries of established English common law. Under ancient legal and theological doctrines, it was absolutely forbidden to try or execute a person who was clinically insane. An insane person could not properly instruct a defense lawyer, nor could they rationally comprehend their own sins to make a true, coherent confession to a priest before the axe fell. In the deeply religious landscape of the 1540s, to execute someone in a state of madness was to actively and deliberately condemn their eternal soul to the unquenchable fires of hell. It was considered a profound, unforgivable sin, a legal line that even the most brutal medieval kings historically refused to cross. According to the laws of God and men, this clinical madness should have been her final unbreakable shield. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was eventually sent into the depths of the tower to interrogate her. Cranmer was a seasoned political operator. He was a man highly accustomed to dealing with terrified, desperate prisoners facing the block. But he was deeply shaken by what he witnessed inside Jane's cell. He wrote a letter directly back to the king. He officially reported that Lady Rochford was entirely disconnected from reality. Many modern medical historians and forensic psychologists analyze these primary sources carefully. They strongly suggest she was not faking this madness. It was not a calculated legal ploy to avoid execution. She was genuinely gone. She had suffered a severe acute psychotic break. She was reportedly screaming into the darkness of her cell. She was tearing violently at her own clothes. She was hallucinating, driven to a state of absolute frenzy by the ghosts of her past and the stark terror of impending death. When King Henry VIII heard this medical report, he did not respond with Christian mercy. He did not feel pity for the woman who had faithfully served his wives for decades. He responded with cold, calculating pragmatism. He immediately dispatched his own personal royal physicians to the Tower. He ordered them to treat Jane. He did not do this because he cared about her mental well-being or her immense suffering. He did it because he needed her sane enough to stand trial. When the king had first learned that his teenage wife had cuckolded him practically in his own bedchamber, his reaction was highly revealing. He had completely broken down. Eyewitnesses recorded the shocking sight of the terrifying, tyrannical king openly weeping in front of his privy council. He was entirely overwhelmed by the profound public humiliation. His carefully constructed image of royal virility was shattered, but those tears quickly evaporated. The weeping cuckold was rapidly replaced by a cold, insatiable, and deeply vindictive tyrant. He possessed a terrifying thirst for blood. He was absolutely not going to let a legal loophole save the woman who had facilitated his mockery. He was not going to let a few centuries of established common law stand in his way. If the law stated he could not legally execute a madwoman, King Henry decided he would simply change the fundamental law of the nation. He bullied, threatened, and forced his parliament to act. He demanded they pass one of the most chilling, tyrannical pieces of legislation in all of English history. It was officially the Treason Act of 1541. Today, modern legal historians simply refer to it as the Lunacy Act. This unprecedented law was a violent tear in the fabric of English justice. It explicitly stated that if a person committed high treason while they were sane, but subsequently went mad before their trial, they could still be tried and executed exactly as if they were in their right mind. It ruthlessly stripped away the absolute last remaining legal protection for the mentally vulnerable. Furthermore, King Henry VIII wanted to spare the crown an ugly, unpredictable public embarrassment. He absolutely did not want to drag a screaming, incoherent woman into a public courtroom. He deeply feared she might reveal the king's deepest physical humiliations to a jury. He could not risk Jane babbling about his impotence or his ulcerated legs in an open forum. So Parliament passed a devastating act of attainder against Jane Rochford and Queen Catherine Howard. This legislative weapon was the ultimate tool of Tudor tyranny. It allowed the government to declare them guilty of treason and sentence them to death without a trial. There was no jury. No evidence was publicly presented. There was absolutely no opportunity for the accused to speak in their own defense. King Henry VIII successfully altered the fundamental laws of English justice for the sole purpose of ensuring Jane Rochford would die. The end came on the cold, bleak morning of February 13th, 1542. At 9 o'clock, on the blood-soaked grass of Tower Green, Jane Rochford was led out of her stone cell. She was forced to endure a final, horrific psychological torture, standing by to watch the brutal beheading of the young Queen Catherine Howard first. When it was her turn to walk up the wooden steps, some accounts suggest Jane experienced a brief moment of lucidity. However, many modern medical historians theorize a much darker, pragmatic reality. Given her previous state of complete mental collapse, they suggest she was likely heavily sedated by royal doctors and rigorously coached by her jailers on exactly what to say to protect her remaining family from the king's ongoing wrath. She did not scream. She delivered the standard, highly scripted scaffold speech, dutifully praying for the long life and health of King Henry VIII. She knelt in the blood-stained straw, and her life was extinguished with a single blow. Her body was quickly gathered up and carried to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, laid to rest under the cold flagged stones, just steps away from Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn, and the husband she was accused of betraying. The violent ripples of the scandal, however, did not stop on Tower Green. The Tudor legal machine, once activated, demanded an undeniable display of the king's total dominance. 2 months prior, the state had already dealt with the men involved at the muddy public execution grounds of Tyburn. Because of his aristocratic status, Thomas Culpeper was granted the grim mercy of a simple beheading. Francis Derham, lacking such high pedigree, was subjected to the absolute maximum terror of English law. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a prolonged, meticulously choreographed public torture designed to completely obliterate the physical body of the traitor. With the Queen, her lovers, and her royal madam eradicated, King Henry VIII attempted to rebuild his fractured ego. He eventually married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. But the king was a fundamentally broken man. His physical decline accelerated rapidly, and he died 5 years later in January 1547, leaving behind a deeply traumatized court and a legal code stained with unprecedented cruelty. It took over a decade for the English legal system to formally address these horrors. In a profound historical irony, when Queen Mary I finally fought her way to the throne in 1553, she was appalled by her father's secular legal tyranny. In her very first year, she ordered her parliament to pass a new Treason Act, taking a massive legal scythe to Henry's legacy. The terrifying Lunacy Act of 1541 was permanently erased from the books. Mary officially restored the humane principle that an insane person could not be dragged to the executioner's block, a quiet victory for basic human rights, but 12 years too late for the Viscountess Rochford. For centuries following her death, historians needed a villain. During the golden reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Tudor historians had to relentlessly protect the pure reputation of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Jane Rochford became the perfect, silent, and convenient scapegoat. They painted her as a malicious, lying monster to whitewash the extreme paranoia, systemic misogyny, and brutal realities of King Henry VIII's court. But the historical truth is far more compelling. Lady Jane Rochford was not a wicked caricature. She was an incredibly intelligent, deeply flawed woman trying to survive a patriarchal political machine that ran entirely on paranoia and shifting alliances. She used the only weapons available to her: hoarded secrets, brilliant political maneuvering behind closed doors, and desperate grit. She survived the fall of an empire, only to be chewed up by a legal system completely corrupted by a wounded king's fragile ego. She did not die because she was a monster. She died because she believed she could outsmart a tyrant, learning too late that in the Tudor court the game was always rigged.